We are already live. We have more than 100 people have joined already. And we're just going to wait until I can see more and more numbers dropping in. So just going to wait a little bit until more and more people come in. But before we start, for those who have come in, hi everyone and welcome. I'm Afrida Chaudhry and I work for Hope Na Hate as the Activism and Operations Officer. And just before we start, I just want to go through some logistics today. We have another person here named Hope Na Hate. That is our colleague Joe, who is monitoring in the back end. So thank you so much for doing that, Joe, and setting this up. Not to be confused by Joe Mulhall as well. There's two Joes. So some logistics today. I mean, we have two buttons down here, which one is a Q&A and one is a chat. So if you want to present yourself where you are and where you're joining in from, that would be great. Please use the chat to just chat. And there's also a Q&A button where you can answer, put your questions up. Please keep them short. We already have some questions that have been sent in. So please keep your questions short as we want to get through as many as possible at the end of this webinar. We're going to try to keep this webinar to approximately 1 hour, 15 minutes. But yeah, so thank you. And just so you're aware, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared to our lovely Hope Na Hate members, to our local activists, to our supporters. And I just want to reiterate that without them, this wouldn't be possible. We are in a pandemic, and as any other organization where we have been struggling, but with your help, that has been, we have been able to do these kinds of events. We have been being able to do our work. So thank you so much for joining in, everyone. Thank you. Okay, so I think we can start now. So I wanted to present everyone who's in this panel. So I'm not sure how everyone's seeing, so I'm just going to go from my left, where I can see Rob, who is, sorry, I'm just like, who was the digital director for Biden for President campaign. He oversaw a team of more than 300 by election days. Rob is also a veteran of the Democratic National Committee, worked for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and also for Beto O'Rourke during the primary. This will be really good news for some of my colleagues at Hope Na Hate. He's also strangely a fan of Norwich City Football Club. I'm not sure if we can flag that as true or false, like Twitter does nowadays.
I can say that is true. I actually, hold on one sec. I just found it this morning. I have my Norwich hat right here.
Oh, wow.
And that is because of one Matthew McGregor who brought me to Caro.
I know, I guess Gemma there as well, who's cheering. And also, next person I want to introduce is Rebecca Rinkovich. Please tell me if I'm pronouncing your names wrong. Who was the director of Digital Rapid Response for the Biden for President campaign and was formerly the director for political programs of Bully Pulpit Interactive. On the Biden campaign, Becca was closely involved in running the Malarkey Factory, which we can't wait to hear more about. We can't wait to hear more about this. And finally, we have Timothy Dorrigan, who is the security analyst at the Democratic National Committee. He previously worked for the party's campaign arm for the U.S. House of Representatives and for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Lastly, we're also joined by my colleague, Dr. Joe Mulhall, who is the senior researcher at Hope Na Hate. So welcome, everyone, and welcome everyone who is joining in. If you're joining in late, I'm just letting you know we have a Q&A at the end where you can ask questions. Please keep those questions short because I know there's going to be tons of them. So yeah, I just wanted to start off by asking Rob, could you speak more about like the challenges that you had and what the campaigns faced and what strategy that you used?
Yeah, so I'll start, but I want Tim and Becca to really dive in. First of all, thank you all to Hope Not Hate for having us and for all the work you do. And hello to everybody. I see some friends in the chat, and so I'm excited to be here with all of you. Yeah, I mean, I think we should just dive in. was sort of in this position to be digital director for the campaign. But as we sort of mentioned, I was on the Clinton campaign in 2016, and if you recall, we did not win. We lost, and one of the things that was a factor in that was vast sort of misinformation spread in sort of right-wing corners of the internet, and that misinformation sort of spread over into the mainstream, and those narratives ended up having a real effect on the outcome of the election. This stuff is not just sort of right-wing lies about how to vote and things like that. It's actually sort of racist creative and content that is aimed at actually sort of suppressing people's willingness to vote, and also persuading people that in the way that a negative ad might, as we have here, and so I think we came into this election, over the last 4 years, the sort of Democratic Party and sort of the center left apparatus thinking about, how do we start to approach this problem, because it's a problem that it really rests on the platforms to solve, right? At the end of the day, it's a problem that is a Facebook problem and a YouTube problem and a Twitter problem. And there's only so much that a campaign can do. One of the smartest things that I think the party did itself was over the last couple of years, they actually invested in a team that Tim runs, and you'll hear from Tim, to detect and track misinformation and misinformation narratives in the sort of various corners of the internet. And then actually go out and flag it to platforms as a violation of their policy. And so that work, I mean, the stuff that they did was a critical asset. I was on a primary campaign before I came to the Biden campaign. As we were trying to win the nomination, and they were a critical asset to every single primary campaign. Tim actually and I met when I was doing Beto O'Rourke's campaign, because he was flagging misinformation about Beto O'Rourke just as much as he was, Amy Klobuchar and the president-elect at the time. And so, Tim will talk about the work that they did, but that piece of infrastructure, I think, was one of the more important decisions that was made in sort of the party space over the last couple of years. We at the campaign cared a lot about this work, and reports that Tim did went to the literal highest levels of the campaign. But we brought Becca on to sort of think through, okay, now that we have these misinformation narratives, what do we actually do? It is one thing to know that there is a lot of conversation online about corruption or mental fitness or any of these things, or the vice president's record on the crime bill, which was sort of a controversial piece of legislation in the early 90s. But it was another to go, okay, now what? And so we spent a lot of time thinking through, how do we take what Tim was surfacing with his team, and how do we actually get a sense of impact, right? Is it actually does it actually matter? Because for us, where we just care about electoral outcomes, if something is just staying in a right-wing bubble and not breaking out and not keeping people or turning people off from voting, then it's not necessarily worth our campaign's time to lift up to our campaign's time to invest in ameliorating. So we actually took this up, Tim surfaced and put it into polling research, and found which pockets of the electorate found the stuff credible, and then which of the people who found it credible were voters that we actually needed and needed to communicate with as a sort of reactive measure. And then there were all kinds of interventions that we did via paid digital and also influencers and people with large social followings to sort of push it back. The idea being that, the solution is never going to be like fact check this, that, or the other. The solution is going to be sort of treating people's finding the thing persuasive on an individual level credibly, and then just sort of hitting them with counter messages that would persuade them back and persuade them away. And so that was sort of the core of the program. It was sort of a system by which we did all of those things. And it was this was funded by a bucket of money for experiments that we were running, which we called the Malarkey Factory. But this was sort of one program thereof. And so we faced these challenges. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not sitting here saying that we solved the problem of misinformation in the United States. That is far from over. These were protective measures that the campaign could take against itself. The real answer is going to have to be, the longer term work of what platforms do to mitigate that. And Tim can kind of speak to it. But, these were things the campaign did to be proactive and be, on offense when it came to those things. So, I think we're still getting the sort of full results of what the work sort of led to. But, I think it was a critically important part of our program.
Thank you, Rob. There's a question that came up here in the chat that might be quite relevant to it, and it's asking about if there was any tools that were missing when working with the strategy, or if there was any gap that you thought about.
Oh, sorry, can you say that again?
In your strategy, is there any tools that you thought were missing when talking about it?
I think we had a pretty good set of tools. I'm actually kind of curious to hear what Tim and Becca kind of thought about what the missing links are.
Yeah, in terms of the landscaping of social media and threat detection, understanding kind of what the conversation was, we certainly would have loved to have more data. Certain social media companies are more forthcoming with what's being said than others. I think our visibility into places like Instagram, which is actually a fairly large political conversation, was pretty limited. So things like that I think would have been helpful, but we're limited by the terms of service of the social media companies themselves and kind of what we can see.
Perfect, thank you. I want to move on to Rebecca. Thank you so much, Rob, for explaining that. I know you work a lot with integrating traditional and digital research. Could you speak more about that?
Yes. So really at the core of this program was taking the best of digital and social listening and the best of traditional research to understand the playing field and what the most impactful and effective remediation we could do was. As Rob mentioned, the DNC had made a huge investment in social listening and disinformation tracking over the last 4 years. And so what we did was we built off of that infrastructure using their inputs and their tracking of the top narratives and the top hits based on mentions and engagement, and then putting that into weekly polling. So quantitative polling to get us a good sense of the different cohorts and our key audiences that were being impacted by each narrative, and what impact that was having on attitudes towards our candidate and our opposition, but actually on vote choice. So really grounding all of our decision makings in what was going to impact the eventual outcome of the election. So that was one piece of sort of our traditional research operation. The other piece was focus groups. So in addition to understanding the mechanics and the dynamics of the race and how disinformation was having an impact, also understanding what messages can counteract that was really core to our research. The outcome of those two sort of bodies of work we use to inform an always-on digital remediation campaign. So in that vein too, sort of taking the best of both worlds, we targeted folks based on online behavioral cues, building out personas based on the type of content they were consuming, what they were searching, the kinds of websites they were visiting, so that we could target folks in real time as they were exposed to that disinformation, and have a very quick turn response. We also worked to inoculate those groups that we were seeing be particularly impacted in polling. So taking a look at the different cohorts that were most susceptible to each narrative and standing up those countermeasures targeting those demographics. The combination of, and then of course, across both of those efforts, we regularly measured our impact and got a better understanding of what messages were working and the impact we were having on real world metrics like attitudes towards our candidates and vote choice. A few things that we learned, and I'm sure we'll dig into this even more, but at a very high level, we found that the volume of mentions doesn't necessarily translate to impact on vote choice or attitude shifts. A great example of this was the Hunter Biden narrative, which we saw blow up in the weeks leading up to the election. However, we didn't find that translated to the outcomes we were concerned about, being change in vote choice or demotivation of our base. We were really focused on both the folks that were still deciding and those who are with us but might not turn out. So our sort of integrated research and social media operation helped us decide that was not going to be a priority narrative for the campaign to engage in. We also found, and I think this is sort of the first thing you learn in Comms 101, but not to treat the hit, to treat the wound. So by that, I mean, we saw a huge amount of volume and a lot of impact on narratives like Joe Biden was being manipulated by the radical left and disinformation around his mental acuity. But what we found through our research, both qualitative and quantitative, was that the core of that hit and the reason why it was catching on with folks was that it hit his strength as a leader. And so you'll see in our countermeasures that the content we put forth doesn't directly address those things. We're not raising the hit to combat it, but rather just reinforce truths about Joe Biden and his record and his policies. Which brings me to another thing that we learned, which was that really raw, authentic, platform-specific, social-friendly content was the thing that broke through with people, especially for folks who are exposed to disinformation. We found that they knew a lot of what they were seeing was not accurate, and they would go so far as to say that they knew it was doctored, but it raised doubts for them. So we found, especially in countering disinformation, it was important that we had this very authentic content that we responded with, and we're lucky to have a candidate who had a lot of that sort of thing and an incredible content team that was able to produce it. And then just a couple notes on sort of our eventual top line impact. We found over the course of our campaign in tracking with our traditional research and in-flight ads measurement that the risk and the hit concern around mental acuity in particular went down by 8 points over the course of our campaign. And in looking at the number of folks who moved in vote choice, we saw about 200K folks shore up their votes for the president-elect based on the ads that we served in our campaign. So a very quick and dirty high-level look at our program, but happy to dig in more.
Thank you so much, Becca. There was a question posed. I think it's good to take it now as we're on it. Posed by Asaf, who was asking if you could elaborate on the tools and platform you use to monitor social media and the measure impact among target audience.
That is the perfect segue to Tim, who can dig in on the social media piece. I can speak to the impact work we did, which was polling that we ran through Bully Pulpit Interactive, and a lot of in-flight measurement through them too, which I'm happy to expand on. But I think folks are eager to hear about the social listening piece, which is really unique and Tim can speak to.
Great. I will jump in. Thanks for having me. Appreciate the invitation. Um, I will talk about kind of our whole program, but actually the first piece is kind of the threat detection and how we were mapping out the internet, understanding kind of the conversation as it pertained to the candidates and issues that mattered. So we took kind of a hybrid approach. So we used some really inexpensive commercial tools because we don't have a lot of money here at the DNC, but some really cheap tools like BuzzSumo is a good one, and a tool called Trendalizer out of Belgium, which is also pretty inexpensive, giving us a pretty good view into kind of what was happening on the major social media sites. And then we also built a little bit more of an elaborate in-house tool using a data scientist on our team that was pulling from various APIs, plugging into kind of open source data sets around like media, media quality, media bias, to try to understand kind of users or accounts political persuasion. And so we could say, you know, this certain attack, like one of the ones that Becca mentioned, is coming from just folks on the political right. It's not breaking through and being talked about elsewhere. So we kind of put all those different data sets together into an internal tool to track kind of the major disinformation narratives levied at the candidates themselves. I hope that's a good overview, and happy to kind of dig in further if that's where folks are curious. Kind of the second piece of our program at the DNC, which as Rob mentioned, kind of started in 2019, was around countermeasures. So kind of what are the things that we can do about it when we know this stuff is happening. And for a long time, until you know, Rob and Becca came around, there wasn't too much. There are a couple of things that we could do, mainly where there were terms of service violations on social media. Those were cases where we could usually report that type of content or that type of behavior, whether it was, you know, coordinated inauthentic behavior or, you know, incitement or hate. Get that to the attention of the social media companies. They were generally pretty good at enforcing their rules. You know, their rules obviously leave a lot to be desired, but where there were violations, they were generally good about enforcing. The second piece was fact checking, and while that is certainly not a great solution, it's one of the tools that we could use to try to get you know, the mainstream conversation moving away from certain disinformation, and also get demotions on certain platforms like Facebook for kind of problematic content. And then the third piece is kind of what Rob and Becca talked to, which is a combination of, you know, digital organizing, inoculation, paid communications, you know, building our own megaphone and making sure that we were there first and most often with the people that we needed to win. So those are kind of the countermeasures. Third piece of our program was around education. And so just teaching people how to approach misinformation. One of the things Becca said that's super important is, you know, we don't want to reinforce disinformation when we're rebutting it. Anytime we're saying, no, this thing is not true, we're saying the thing that's not true, and that's going to reinforce it in people's minds. And so we want to be really careful that we're saying the truth and we're doing it repeatedly, because generally that's how our brains work. We tend to believe what we hear first and most often. So certainly focus on educating not just kind of campaign operatives, but also trying to push journalists to be more responsible in their own kind of coverage and framing decisions. Push social media companies to be more responsible for the content on their sites, which again has a lot of room for improvement still. And also kind of just the general public, you know, what are some best practices, slowing down, thinking before you're sharing, trying to understand what folks on social media are trying to get you to do when they appeal to your emotions and whatnot. And then the last piece was specifically on social media policy. And so just having conversations with folks at those companies and saying, hey, you know, this is a problem. This is something that you should be addressing. You know, I won't claim a lot of success there, but I think at the margins we were able to do a little bit. So that's kind of a quick overview of kind of our approach on the organic side. But I think all of us are eager to take questions from you all and learn more.
Perfect, thanks. Before I move on to Joe, I think there's one question that's been posed a few times that kind of speaks to what you said, Timothy, and it's about like echo chambers, social media that are an echo chamber for information that people want to hear. So how can individuals seek to influence others and pull them out of that conspiracy rabbit hole or disinformation rabbit hole?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. The answer is empathy and tenacity, unfortunately, which are hard. Anytime you are telling someone they're stupid for having the beliefs that they have, the reaction is not going to be agreeing with you and being enlightened and deciding that they're all of a sudden going to have your beliefs. They'll have a defensive reaction to that. So being empathetic, understanding that a lot of times these folks are victims of their own biases and social media companies manipulating their biases. So, understanding where they're getting their information, trying to kind of push them towards more authoritative sources of information, I think is probably the most helpful. One of the things we talked about in our trainings was, if it's someone who's close to you, and if this is happening in like a social media environment, reaching out privately is actually probably the most effective, because even, a response, even an empathetic, super polite, hey, I don't think this is quite right response is going to trigger kind of, if not a defensive reaction from the sharer, just embarrassment. Like no one wants to be, the victim of fake news and have shared like fake news on social media. So extreme empathy and then patience, I think, with people is the best approach, but it is hard because these are really powerful manipulative technologies that are playing on our biases and kind of pushing us to have our worldviews affirmed on a daily basis. So it's an uphill climb, and another reason why the terrain matters and what the social media companies are doing kind of matters quite a bit. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, I just wanted to ask if you could, I would love to hear if you could expand a little bit more on how you use digital organizing to counter disinformation. If you can expand a little bit more, like something that you might find be very unique to the campaign that you used that really worked, or anything that you might find like, oh, I actually found this was really interesting when I was working with it. That would be really cool to hear. Any one of you.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, and then I don't know, Tim, Becca, if you want to kind of go off of that. So yeah, I mean, I know there's a second panel we're doing on digital organizing. We had one of the largest digital organizing operations that's sort of ever been set up, and that was not on my team, but sort of a second digital organizing team. I think one of the things is we trained our digital organizers and our supporters on some of the same stuff that Tim was just talking about. He was running those trainings on how to have those one-to-one conversations with people in situations where you encounter misinformation. But the second thing is we focused on sort of not just like how do we get our supporters to share stuff online, but on influencers, so creators, and we took a wide range with that. So that goes from a YouTube creator all the way down to a pastor who has a Facebook following that is big in Florida, right? And what we were finding in the research were, the messages that were and the kinds of content that were sort of able to engage people. So, for example, if there was this sort of question about the president-elect's mental fitness, which was a sort of hit against him that the polling found to be effective. It was also very easy to ameliorate by showing content of the vice president speaking, right? Because that gives people proof without like showing them up, right? And so we encourage those people to share content that did that thing, and that helped disprove from a research perspective, the thing without being in their face about it, saying fact check, or if you believe this, you're wrong. And so that was just like one sort of example. It came from figuring out ways to get people to share content at scale, whether they were supporters in our supporter ecosystem or just, you know, people with large audiences who we were sort of pitching to get to share stuff.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. I want to move on to Joe, and I want to ask you if you could share some thoughts, your own thoughts. I know we in Orfalea, we work with a lot with disinformation in the UK and Europe, and yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts about this? Hearing from the three of them.
Yeah, sure. I'll speak very briefly because I'm sure people don't want to hear from me; they want to hear from you guys. So I'll speak very briefly on some of the reflections actually on what you were saying, because unsurprisingly, a lot of what you're saying sounds extremely familiar in the UK context, and some of it sounds very different. So it's really interesting. I mean, misinformation has become a really important bit of Hope Not Hate's work actually in the last few years. We've set up a new unit quite recently looking at conspiracy theories and misinformation, because it's, despite being an organisation that looks at the far right and looks at hate groups, it's got broader than that, and the problems that we face are much bigger. And we do, it's interesting, a few of the things you mentioned are similar to some of the things we're doing in terms of we track on a daily basis using kind of software these different types of misinformation and their effect, but also do polling off the back of that to try and find out how much traction the misinformation is getting in broader society, and then trying to find, you know, ways to engage with counter-narrative work. But I guess in one sense, in many ways, like all things, the British version seems to be somewhat smaller than the American one. And when we look at the scale of the misinformation and disinformation that you guys are dealing with, some ways it makes my eyes water. Although, of course, we have seen similar sorts of trends here. I mean, lots of research is being done still about misinformation around the Brexit campaign, for example. And that ranged from the outright fabrications through to the just incorrect. And some of which I think probably did have a large impact on the Brexit vote. And it was really interesting, you mentioned at the beginning, Rob, about how there's a crossover with the right wing and there's a crossover with the far right, and a lot of this is because a lot of the discussion in society is often about secret Russian farms doing this, that and the other, whereas actually a huge amount of the misinformation we encounter that has a damaging effect in the UK is from domestic individuals creating content on social media here in the UK from a right wing or far right perspective, rather than necessarily some sort of conscious intervention. But then I guess that's somewhat different around elections. One of the differences I thought was really interesting is of course, you were doing it within an election, and much of the work that we do around this misinformation is outside of elections, and it's much broader in the sense it's about the effect of misinformation on societal positions or societal norms. And so it's broader than a specific candidate or a specific election, and it's much broader. It's about attitudes in society, and we've seen this year has actually been really, really troubling for Hope Not Hate, looking at how misinformation around things like COVID-19 and some of the and how actually a lot of the stuff that we've been monitoring online has spilled onto the streets in the UK. One of the big things for us is not necessarily just how people might vote in an election, but for us, of course, it was really interesting. I think Tim, you said, or maybe it was Becca, saying that you're really interested in it when it breaks through, when it's going to have an effect on people's voting patterns, or it's going to affect a constituency in an election. We have that as well, of course, but also being an anti-hate organisation, for us sometimes misinformation spread amongst a small but very active or violent group is our concern. Even though it won't have an effect on society, someone might do something terrible. They might attack a mosque, they might attack a synagogue. So that was something that I thought was something slightly different. And then Becca, you mentioned authentic content, which I thought was fascinating, because one of the huge things that I completely agree with what you said is it's not necessarily sometimes about people believing this misinformation, it's about them just stopping believing anything. And this is one of the troubles, and maybe I'll have some questions later about that, because it's one of the things we're really struggling with, which is it's not necessarily that individuals believe every bit of misinformation they're seeing on social media, it's that they just stop believing official narratives, which becomes really, really problematic for us. And then Timothy, yeah, you said it was about breaking through, and I thought that was interesting. And I wonder if as that will shift somewhat once you're then kind of in power, or Biden is in power, that'll be interesting to see if it's not just about the voting constituencies, it's going to be a slightly broader. So one of the things I guess Hope Not Hate are looking at really closely is how do we counteract this? And that's why it's really interesting hearing some of your thoughts. And I mean, we're doing a few things. Some of it is basically, as you say, monitoring. Some of it is counter-narrative work. And then the other bit for us is deplatforming, which has been really important here in the UK. And I Hope Not Hate got David Icke deplatformed, which was a major spreader of kind of COVID misinformation here in the UK. And then the other side is education. And then something that we're quite lucky with in the UK is all this current discussion about legislation in the United Kingdom, which we've just put out a report called A Better Web with our recommendations for what legislation should look like. But while the government's dragging its heels a little bit, it's coming down the pipeline. So that's really exciting for us, is dealing with it. And this, I guess, brings me on to two questions. I don't know who's best to, I will open it up in a second, but I want to kind of abuse my position and grab questions because I have some. One is basically, we engage with platforms. We engage with all the major platforms or any of the platforms we can talk to. And we are critical, but as friendly as is necessary or possible. Obviously, you would have been working really closely, I presume, with most of the major platforms through this campaign. We've noticed here in Europe that different platforms have very different levels of interaction, are hugely different in terms of how good they are, how engaged they are. So I would love to hear which platforms you thought were good, which ones you thought were bad. And I don't know if you're allowed to name and shame, but we'd love to know which ones you thought were especially problematic, because I'd be fascinated to see if they're the same here. And then the other question, again, I don't know who wants to jump in on it, would be, one of the big problems I think we're facing with the misinformation in the UK is not just the role that fabricated or misinformation is playing, but selective truth or selective propaganda, if you will. A lot of the groups that we would monitor, for example, the vast majority of the content in their groups, say it's an anti-Muslim movement, is true. It's not that the story is fabricated. It's just that the only thing that they post in that group is 1,000 articles a week about halal food all over the world. And they create this perception that halal and Islam is taking over the world. And it's not that the stories are not true. It's just that they are very selective in their choosing. And I wonder if that's something that you had to come up with that goes slightly beyond just saying this is fabricated, this is fact checked, it's not true, and how you deal with it when something is true, but they present it in a manner or with a mass of it that it becomes untrue. So there's the two questions. I don't know who might jump on. Which is the best tech platforms, which is the worst, and how do you deal with kind of true misinformation, if that's not a paradox?
Yeah, I can jump in. I won't do like 1 to 10 best social media companies, but we do have a scorecard actually on our website, which rates some of the major social media companies on a bunch of different metrics. We have little stars there, so you can see kind of how they are doing on the different measures. I think generally we were impressed by a company called Snapchat. I'm not sure how prevalent that is abroad, but Snapchat is actually quite good. They have learned the lessons, I think, of their peers. They're a newer company and kind of by design have had more control over the content that gets reach. They employ humans, is a novel concept for social media companies, but they employ humans to fact check, especially on the ad side. So they have kind of laid out a marker, I think, that others can learn from. So that's what I would say, I guess, on the social media side. In terms of the propaganda aspect, I think it's a huge problem. One of the things that Facebook has touted is their fact-checking program, which is problematic and insufficient in a lot of ways. But the problem that you mentioned, Joe, is super important, because even if the fact-checking was happening perfectly, there would still be the ability to deceive with framing and with coverage choices. So similar to the halal example you gave, in the US, there's a company called Mad World News. And basically they will take, 4 and 5-year-old really heinous crimes, usually perpetrated against women or children by, people of color. And they will circulate those and publish them over and over as if, this was happening on a daily basis. And they can kind of spread, foment racism, encourage hate with truth, even if it's presented in a misleading way. From my perspective, I think this comes down to distribution and quality of content. And one of the things that especially social media has been really hesitant to do is to say certain sources of news are more authoritative than others. They're higher quality than others. And so, to give a US example, the New York Times, which people will call sometimes the paper of record, really authoritative source of information, and that site Mad World News are treated the same. They look the same on Facebook. And so, if a Mad World News clip is getting a lot of likes, Facebook is going to say, hey, this is good content, and they're going to push it out just the same as if the New York Times did that. And usually the New York Times is not going to get as many likes because the content they're putting out is factual, it's nuanced, it's boring, but accurate. And so there's kind of a natural preference for this type of clickbait, inciting content. And so I think that's certainly a frontier where we need to go. Another example along the lines is, what's been happening over the last couple of weeks here in the US, where imperfections in the voting process, misunderstandings of the voting process have been taken in small pieces and used to create this picture of systemic voter fraud, which does not exist. But 2 ballots were misplaced by a new worker in this county, and all of a sudden you put 2 or 3 of these very small examples together, and they can weaponize these small examples and create this overall picture that the election was held illegitimately. So I think that's a really good place to put your finger on, is something that really hasn't been addressed in a good way yet.
And on the second question, I would add, when you're looking for the counter messages, or in cases where you have the resources for a counter campaign, one of the positive things that has come out of the coverage and the attention drawn to disinformation and the issues it's posing to society is that it's sown seeds of doubt with people who are exposed to it. So as I mentioned before in our research, folks have started to point out and will flag for us that though a piece of disinformation has raised doubts for them, they recognize that it could be one and is likely doctored, or that it's one proof point as part of a much broader narrative. What we found in our work trying to counter both of those sorts of disinformation is that once we give, when we provide a bigger picture, so in our case, that meant outlining the vice president at the time's policy objectives, his record, his goals, his team. Once we sort of gave that holistic picture and informed folks of really our objectives and our values, it assuaged them of those concerns. So that's not going to work for the folks that are sort of at the farthest ends of the spectrum and are sharing that information. And that's really where the platform remediation is critically important. But for those in the middle who are still making up their minds and maybe just see it as a one-off and have doubts, that fuller picture and just authentic, accurate information makes a world of difference.
Thank you so much for those questions, and Joe for posing that question. I'm going to go to the Q&A now. Bear with me, guys. There's tons of questions, and we might be jumping around with some questions that have been asked before. So sorry if I'm not taking your question directly. There's some questions that have been asked a few times, so I'm just going to try to get some themes in. But the first question comes from Stephen Dowd, who is an MP. He's asking, when tackling right-wing conspiracies, whether it's, for example, Trump lies, QAnon, or anti-vax, what is the most effective rebuttal technique every elected representative candidate team should invest time and energy in? And would you say that the same technique applies across all platforms, or does it always have to be platform specific? I'm not sure who wants to take that question.
I can give it a first crack, and then Rob and Tim, you guys should jump in. In addition to this direct-to-camera, authentic content that I'm speaking to, the other thing that we found critically important was having a a bunch of validators weigh in and lend their credibility to the case that we were making. So from a content perspective, that looked like news articles and publications that spanned the spectrum of ideological leaning. And it looked like different campaign surrogates and supporters, from military officials to ex-Republicans and to real people. On the content side of things, that was very important, and sort of showing that having that show of force helped to reaffirm our narrative to folks. And then Rob mentioned earlier sort of that validation and those different voices isn't just in content, but it was also through our distribution channels. So in addition to pushing stuff through our own channels, having other organizations, partners, influencers lend their voices as well was very helpful.
And I could jump in here too, and let me just say I think we're also very impressed by Stephen's work in this space, and Hope Not Hate as well. So thank you for all that you guys are doing as well on this front. Honestly, in terms of the conspiracy theories, like, just to answer your question verbatim, like the best, and Joe mentioned this before, the most effective solution is deplatforming. The best way to prevent disinformation from reaching people is to not expose them to it in the first place. Obviously, that is a tool that the powers that be tend not to want to use, unfortunately. But that is certainly the most effective. Just to give an example, I guess, is the QAnon conspiracy theory, which originated in the US, I understand has gone global, unfortunately. This is kind of a just really baseless conspiracy theory that was inspiring violent acts across the country. Ultimately, the FBI in the US released a report saying that it was a kind of a violent domestic terror threat, which finally pushed social media companies to take responsible action. So I mean, and the effect of that was a huge, massive reduction in kind of the prevalence and the spreading of the conspiracy theory. So that might not be a helpful answer, but I think that's honestly the most effective solution if it's possible. In lieu of that, I would agree with everything Becca said, which is kind of leverage trust sources, influencers, media outlets that exist that people trust in to the extent that they trust in those, and kind of creating a broad response.
Thank you. I think it leads quite well to this question posed by Alex from Stop Funding Hate. Like advertisers, they fund platforms and publishers promote and host disinformation. So they're asking, what do you think the role is for consumer movements such as Sleeping Giants and industry initiative such as Conscious Advertising Network in combating the spread of disinformation and hate online? And there's a few questions generally about how platforms and advertisements on like Facebook and other platforms have you need to use their initiative to spread disinformation and hate online.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So much of the disinformation that we see in the US is profitable, and it exists because there's a viable business model for it, unfortunately. And until that changes, that's going to continue. Sleeping Giants and the Disinformation Index and I forget, sorry, the other groups you mentioned, Frida, but that they've done heroic work. Honestly, Breitbart was a massive force in American politics, and Sleeping Giants just like screen capping articles and telling companies that their ads were showing up next to, really racist, gross content was just super effective. The companies had no idea that was happening, and they pulled their ads, and the revenue for Breitbart kind of fell off a cliff. So I think generally and this runs across the spectrum, not just social media, to the extent that we can get off of advertiser-funded media generally is good. But certainly in these cases, it's AdSense and Facebook and all these different companies kind of just driving traffic and revenue to sources that really shouldn't have a viable business model. And it's more just kind of ignorance and just kind of a lack of caring about what's happening that's allowing that to happen.
Thanks. I think this is going to be a quick question that someone asked. What would you say is the big learning or big difference from Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 that some of you have worked on until today when tackling disinformation?
Well, I'll say it's the scale of resources available to us, I think is a big one. We had social listening tools in 2016, but I don't think an ecosystem had been stood up to figure out what to do with it. And Tim and the DNC sort of built a program that was really, really good at saying, okay, we have our finger on the pulse of what's bubbling up, but then we're gonna engage with platforms to actually do something about it. And so I think it's the fact there's just more of an ecosystem of understanding and action, I think is the biggest difference. And then obviously you add on top the tools that the campaign was able to sort of add to Tim's program and the DNC's program as we scaled up. I think that sort of made the difference. I still think we have substantive problems. I still think that we have a long way to go when it comes to tackling the issue. But it's just that there is more in place, and there is more avenues. I mean, I remember when we were in 2016 flagging that like people on 4chan were posting the wrong election date on Facebook pages that have huge or the wrong election date. Some of the wrong election date was being targeted at the Black community. We went to Facebook and would say there's a problem here, and they in 2016 they said there's not a policy violation. Now in 2016 there's a whole team at a pretty junior level. Now in 2020 there was a pretty robust team that was constantly interfacing with them. So I think those differences are pretty stark in terms of the resources that were available.
Thank you. There's another question from Arch Singh from HuffPost UK. Do you think there is any read across from what you guys did in the election campaign to the fight in tackling anti-vax disinformation? And do you think governments and social media companies are doing enough in this space in relation to any potential COVID vaccine? How bad is the problem? What should they be doing, etc.? Cheers.
I can jump in here. I think the model we've built here is applicable to any major industry or body of disinformation. Anti-vax narratives seems like a very applicable parallel here. The core of our strategy is to track the disinformation that's catching hold and understand the audiences that are impacted. For vaccines in particular, obviously has real world outcomes, and that someone might choose to get a vaccine or not based on the disinformation that they're exposed to. So I think it's a worthy and critically important investment, especially where we are in the world right now, to study the impacts of that and for governments and organizations to set up countermeasures wherever possible. And again, on the countermeasures piece here, getting accurate information in front of folks will likely do a world of difference in them making up their minds.
Thank you. There's a question from Sarwat, who is a behavioral change consultant and a Muslim and female, and she's wondering in terms of the research of varied demographies. What did you do to ensure trust from, example, the Muslim community, but also there's been question about different demographics? How do you ensure trust when doing your digital campaigning?
Is the question, sorry, do you mind repeating the question? Is it how do we target specific demographics?
Yeah, and ensure that you have the trust from them as well. Or how did you do it during this campaign?
Yeah, so we stood up 2 different targeting techniques. The first was just directly targeting people who had recently been exposed to disinformation. That was demographic agnostic, and we really saw as sort of a treatment campaign. The second was demographic targeted insofar as we built out different personas for the different parts of our key audiences, both persuadable and our supporters. And then targeted them with custom campaigns based on the narratives that they were exposed to. We were lucky enough to be able to implement a pretty robust measurement tool against that. So over the course of our ad campaign at the demographic level, we were looking at how people's attitudes towards the different attributes we were tracking against the candidates changed, as well as their ultimate vote choice. So we were pretty honed in and thinking about the campaign sort of on the demographic level and about who the cohorts are that we needed in order to win.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. In addition to the paid, I think from a philosophical level, I think the Biden campaign was very, they made diversity a priority, from the beginning. And so, staffing the campaign with a diverse set of voices, all the way to, finding surrogates who supported the campaign to kind of speak to specific communities. People who looked like the communities they were trying to communicate with. The DNC had an initiative starting, I think, in 2019 called Seat at the Table that really reached out to traditionally marginalized and underrepresented groups in the country. And so I think, in addition to kind of the really tactical stuff that Becca was talking about, I think, there's a philosophical approach from the get-go that, we wanted to be abroad and just kind of in our DNA on the Democratic side. Like, we are a diverse, broad, big tent party, and we want everyone represented, and kind of that was key to kind of everything the campaign did, and definitely paid dividends as specific groups were targeted with disinformation.
Thank you. We had some questions come in as well earlier, and this is more a question about non-US state actors and tackling disinformation. So was all the disinformation generated internally, or was there some from other nation states? And if so, which states were they, and what was their general focus? Another question is the role of non-US social media accounts and posing as Americans and spreading disinformation. I think we have a similar phenomenon in the UK as well. Would it be possible or effective for social media platform to show which countries an account is posting from as well? This question comes from Aled and Duncan.
Yeah, really good questions. So I would say one of the areas where I think the whole country and the West generally really focused after Brexit in 2016 was around foreign interference. And so, both, or actually I should say all social media companies themselves, civil society, government, all kind of focused in this area of foreign, especially state disinformation and influence operations. That certainly, I think, is an area of success. We saw folks who are affiliated with the Russian Internet Research Agency having to hire Americans to write, humans to write content for them that they would then push across social media. And so like we're at a much higher level of investment from bad actors, foreign bad actors, where they can't just create groups and start memeing and start dividing the country. They actually had to like spend money and reach out to humans and connect with them and encourage them and pay them to write things that were favorable to them. And even those efforts were shut down really quickly. And so I think in terms of the foreign interference, we can be pretty happy, at least a foreign state interference, we can be pretty happy with how everyone kind of came together on that. That being said, there's definitely an underbelly of like scam content and like content farms that is foreign. It's not necessarily politically motivated. These are folks who are just kind of trying to make money online, and what they've generally found is that talking about American politics tends to make them more money than talking about, you know, motorcycles or whatever they were going to talk about before that. And so there was quite a bit of that, more like spam content, honestly, but has the same political effect. And so that type of content is still fairly prevalent, and it's one of the things that we focused on at the DNC. Sorry, there were a lot of pieces to that question, but if I missed anything, let me know.
I think that was great. Going back a little bit to platforms again, there's two questions. First of all, do you think the steps that Facebook took in stopping new political ads being submitted the week before the election had any impact on the spread of misinformation? And another one is, what is platforms' financial incentive for fixing misinformation, especially if competing parties will pay to hyper-target ads?
Let me try to channel, I think, some of the concern. So it's actually quite a long story about how that last week came about. Basically, I think many people on our side in the U.S. think that we can have political advertising on social media, and we can also not allow disinformation in social media advertising. That's a fairly non-controversial desire. Certain social media companies, you know, Facebook among probably more among any of them, didn't necessarily want to do that, especially as it came to political candidates themselves. And so they came up with this kind of exemption for politicians, and then you know, saying that there'd be scrutiny, public scrutiny at content and rebuttals and fact checks presented somewhere else. You know, these are targeted digital ads, so it doesn't really make sense what they were doing, but that's kind of how they presented it. And so this last week was supposed to allow them to have public scrutiny of lies in digital ads. What we found was one, that it broke the advertising platform in the last week of the election, which was really problematic for us getting our get out the vote messages and some of our fundraising messages and some of our like closing argument messaging. So that was a pretty big failure. And then we also didn't see the scrutiny that was, you know, kind of the goal of that week-long blackout or on new ads at least. So overall, I think that was pretty disastrous policy.
Thank you. There are some questions about local versus national versus kind of like the Senate way and the House, where disinformation tactics and I mean the campaign that you were doing targeted differently depending on what kind of election there was.
So I think a little bit of both. I think certainly the presidential election was the one that got the most attention, but we certainly saw disinformation targeted at down ballot candidates. Some of it echoing the same lines as what was happening at the top of the ticket, and some of it more race specific. We, you know, the down ballot, so the senatorial and the House campaigns were also very cognizant of this problem and invested in detection and remediation. And so it's certainly not just something for, you know, large national campaigns. It's definitely something that everyone needs to be aware of. Unfortunately, like campaigns like that, and I'm sure this is true in the UK, don't have the resources really to do what we were able to do. Like we had, I don't know how many millions of dollars to be able to do what we did. Whereas, these smaller campaigns don't have the resources to do that, and anything that they're doing to remediate against disinformation is money that's not being spent, turning out their voters in small elections. So I think it's really challenging for smaller campaigns to do this type of stuff. And yeah, it's hard. I think one of the things that we tried to do at the DNC as kind of the national committee was to try to provide that support kind of across the spectrum to the extent that we could.
Thank you. I guess this is a question for everyone. And this is probably a little bit personal one. I mean, Susie is asking, as a social media manager, I often have to deal with angry messages and false information, which can be quite challenging to read and manage. Were there any times where you find it really hard to deal with this information on a personal level? And if so, did you have any strategies to protect your own well-being? And I think there's a lot of social media and comms people in this call who probably love to hear about this. And then there's also someone who asks if you have slept since the campaign ended.
I'll start, and then Becca and Tim should sort of finish. I mean, I will say we were pretty intentional, because not even about misinformation. I mean, when you are a social media manager, you are exposed to everything, right? When you're running the accounts, you see all the comments about everything, the best and the worst. I think we certainly were cognizant of the fact that a lot of our social staff sort of took it on board. They were sort of on the front lines, and so we were really intentional about making sure that the staff who were running the social accounts were taking days off, which is a thing that you don't do on campaigns. But we were pretty intentional about, or at least have time to sort of step away, because I think, to the point of the question, it is a bit of a mental health drain when you're doing this stuff. So we were, we sort of almost as a work thing made people who are exposed to it sort of step back. I've seen the stress from a number of the folks that we had in 2016 who were monitoring this stuff and sort of what it does to them. So sort of curious to hear Tim and Becca's thoughts about, how to manage through that.
Yeah, just at a macro level, we were lucky enough to be able to really closely track the impact of our programs. And I think obviously managing the stress of that on the day-to-day is a terribly difficult thing, but taking solace in knowing that the work you do and getting accurate information out there really makes a difference. And in our case, we were able to see that in a tangible way. It's quite helpful to me and was a nice takeaway from this experience in this program.
Have you guys slept since? How much did you sleep? All right.
Well, I don't know if I want to answer that one. I haven't slept as much as I would like to. I got a couple of nights in, but I think there's a thing, and you guys probably experience this too if you're a campaigner, is there's the adrenaline rush of the run up to election day, and then like the election ends and you're just like tired. And it all sort of hits you. I get this a lot. I don't know if other folks do, but I always get a cold like a week out from election day, which definitely hit me. And like getting a cold right now is like, oh my God. So certainly coping through that, but feeling good.
Thank you. Just a bit of a derail before going back into some other questions. Daniel is wondering if you could talk about which groups are especially vulnerable to disinformation and what kind of disinformation. And did you find different groups vulnerable to different strategies of disinformation?
Yeah, certainly true. This is likely something that's incredibly race and topic dependent. In our case, we found that the types of folks impacted by disinformation depended on what the narrative was. Something we did find, which was interesting, was in Florida, where there seemed to be a lot of concerted outside interference and disinformation efforts targeted against the Latinx community. Those folks were showing real impact in terms of their attitudes towards our candidates and their vote choice. And then across our sort of target states, we found that older people were particularly susceptible to one-off hits. And then across the board, really, it was pretty dependent on what the narrative was and sort of what fears and the like it was playing into.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to take 3 more questions and then we're going to wrap it up. I'm so sorry if we haven't been able to answer all your questions. Just remember, we have 2 more webinars coming up in this webinar series. The next one is going to be on Monday, where we're going to talk more about COVID and the pandemic and organizing during the pandemic. So if you have any questions about that, leave it to then, and you will be able to ask more questions. So there's the questions about what role does traditional media and media relations play in conjunction with digital campaigning during such a hard-fought campaign, and how long in advance do your teams come together in advance of the campaign launching? This is from Nick Ryan.
So the question is just like, how long are people planning for campaigns, and how quickly people come together for launching them?
And what's the difference between traditional media and like digitalized media or digital organizing?
Yeah, oof. The second part of the question is a doctoral thesis, but the first one, I think, the planning for a campaign for a lot of these 2020 campaigns started pretty much after the 2018 midterms. People were getting hired up. I think the first campaign that launched in the 2020 cycle was Warren, and she went on New Year's Eve of 2018, I think. And then people kind of started jumping out from there. The vice president didn't get in until April, as I recall. The president-elect. Oh my gosh, I'm still not used to that. So the planning for that stuff happens over the course of years, right? The candidate is thinking about it. Their advisors are feeling out advisors. There were recruitment calls about the 2020 election going on in 2017. So that process begins in earnest a while back. People generally start joining the staff of a presidential campaign, like at scale, like a couple of weeks out. There's a finite window between the amount of time that you start paying people and when you file with the FEC. But you can start an exploratory committee. So there's just all kinds of like weird campaign finance laws in the US that lead to it. So, I would say usually people start being fully on staff within a month of actually launching in like a semi-secret state of like open secretness. And then the second question about what the difference between traditional and like non-traditional media or digital media. I think the biggest like substantive difference is the difference between a broadcast model and a network model, right? So this idea that the sort of traditional media approach says, we are an entity who will be broadcasting a message either through paid or through earned, through a limited number of outlets that have sort of a rigorous journalistic standards, and the sort of digital media model is more driven by anybody and everybody being able to communicate about anything in sort of public forums. And to Tim's point about the New York Times and sort of Mad World News appearing together, that's just like fake news sites. That's not even counting people who have large followings and are just humans, right? I think the substantive difference is grappling with a world where anyone can amass a platform and say anything, and those forces having real impact on public perception, those forces really driving public opinion in a way that may not seem intuitive to your understanding of a media landscape. And so I think it's led to a system where there are multiple understandings of the world and multiple understandings of the facts that are around the world. And so communicating in that environment, in this sort of in this digital environment, it ends up just being sort of substantively different and strategically different than communicating in a more traditional landscape. I don't know if Tim or Becca have additional thoughts.
I'll jump in on that. So first, I'll just say that I think the calendar that this is just a personal opinion, but the calendar that Rob laid out of the never-ending campaign is definitely not a sign of like a healthy democratic process. I personally am very jealous of European countries with rational campaign finance laws that don't force endless campaigns. And then in terms of the professional media as it comes to disinformation, I think they have learned some since 2016. The goal of like bad actors and disinformation sources is to push their ideas across social media and get it into professional media. We're talking about breaking through and what reaches swing voters before, like mainstream, or in the US we call it like mainstream media, professional media repeating false attacks on our candidate is the goal of disinformation, right? If they can get their lies in front of a broadcast audience, like that is a huge win for them. So fortunately, I think we did see a bit more discipline from professional media this time around. If we compare the Clinton email story to some of the Hunter Biden stuff that happened in 2020, you could see this time around professional journalists were saying, wait a minute, we don't know what this is, what is the relative importance of this? Is this a campaign defining story in the last week? Actually no, and kind of change their behavior based on that. So I don't think we can discount the importance of kind of journalists and editors kind of understanding how they are being targeted with this information, and how bad actors are hoping to kind of leverage their audiences to push their ideas.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the final question because I know we've kind of run over time a bit. And this is a question for everyone in the panel, and it's more specific on the panelists' thoughts on, for example, Parler as a potential powerful tool for disinformation and mobilizing the far right, and how do we actually kind of, manage that? What is it that campaigners, what is it that us working with these can do to kind of stop this mobilization? Are there other threats other than Parler that can become a potential threat into disinformation and mobilizing the far right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in terms of right-wing mobilization, I think it is something to be concerned about. It's a place where folks are going to be able to organize freely and without many of the kind of guardrails that some of the more developed social media companies have. It's going to be curious to see where that goes. I think there's a couple of problems with Parler. One is it's not a good technology product. It's hard to use. Second is like, if there's no one to troll, will trolls use it? And then I think the third is it's hard to see a viable business model there. I can't see advertisers kind of flocking to that product, and it's backed by the Mercer family, so they could theoretically run it forever and just spend their money on it. But I have a hard time believing it's going to be a viable kind of long-term place for folks to organize. But I think that remains to be seen.
I think my perspective here is a question of how it scales and to which audiences. I think as it becomes, and if it becomes more mainstream, it becomes a greater concern and sort of pushing disinformation and making it pervasive among the electorate at large. And that is to be seen.
Thank you so much. I think that's the end of our time. If anyone doesn't want to have like a final word, a word of encouragement, I just want to say thank you so much for coming to our webinar. Is there any final words, Joe, Rob, Timothy, or Becca, that you want to share?
Just thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate talking to you all and what you all are doing.
Yeah, just to say thank you to you guys. I mean, I think there's loads of comments in the same sort of thing. Looking at it from a European perspective, it's fascinating to hear what you have been up to on the front line of a lot of this, and a lot of the stuff that we're going to be needing to steal your ideas, steal your technologies, steal your tactics, because this is a global issue and a global problem. So it's fascinating to hear it, and I'm sure that there's going to be a million emails in your inbox from people listening to this call this week asking how we do similar things in Europe going forward. So thanks very much for taking the time. It's hugely appreciated.
Thank you so much, guys. For everyone who's joining, our supporters, our members, to the panel, I've posted a little link for our support. Please please donate to us. Obviously, with the pandemic, we're also struggling, and we want to keep our work going. So if you want to join our Hope Action Fund, where we can do this research, please do so, our intelligent work. And of course, this is the first one of our webinar series. The next one will be on Monday, same time, and that will be on organizing during the pandemic, during the Biden campaign. So please come and join then. We will send out a new link for everyone who's joined today. So yeah, again, thank you so much for all our members, campaigners, and everyone out there. And I'm going to end this now, otherwise it becomes really awkward. This is filmed and will become going to our members. Thank you, everyone.